Hello Art 2. So let me zoom out just a bit so you can see the entire page here. The purpose of this video is mostly going to be just to show you a couple of the different watercolor techniques that you have access to completing on your techniques page. Remember, you are required to do the salt, the alcohol, the wet on wet, and the lifting. So I'm definitely going to make sure I include some demos of those. But I will also include some demos of some of the other ones that I just think are fun and interesting and helpful to know. So as with any type of watercolor painting, the first thing we want to do is get our palette with a little bit of watercolor paint on it, a cup of water, some brushes, and then we are ready to go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do first is just show you the salt technique, which I know that's probably the one that most of you have used in the past. And I'm just going to put some of my color down, get it pretty saturated, pretty wet, but dense color there. I'm just going to let my colors sort of bleed one into the next, because this is also a wet on wet technique, because I'm painting my wet color right next to my previous color, so it's kind of just blending right into whatever that next color that I'm using is. That's one way of doing the wet on wet technique. So now I'm ready to just throw a little bit of salt on there. I'm just going to dump some out onto my hand, and then I'm just going to kind of sprinkle it around. And you'll see right away that it starts to absorb some of that color. And I'm going to leave that on there because I won't be able to take the salt off until everything is completely dry. And then you can do another layer on top of it if you need. You can just scrape it off and let it be. You can do something else on top. But what we'll do is we'll let that dry, scrape it off. So then in a later on video where I'm showing you some more steps, I'll show you that part too. So now I'm going to show you all the alcohol technique. So I'm going to use a different color. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the different colors do sort of take the effects differently. So because the watercolor paint is made up of different pigments, not every single color is going to have the exact same effect. So you definitely want to always sort of try things out before you use it on an actual painting. So here I'm just going to put like a little square of red inside of my shape. You can definitely use the entire grid if you want. You can do more of a blob, you can do more of a square within it. It's completely up to you. I just need to be able to see your label so that I know that you know which technique you were using. I'm going to drop just a little bit of blue in there just for some fun. Add a little water to help the blue spread around. And then to do the alcohol, I'm just going to take the lid completely off so that you can literally see down in it. I'm going to stick my brush in to kind of soak up some of that alcohol, and then just hold it over the paint. And it's going to drip, and it sort of makes that sort of bullseye splatter type thing there. And I do have a spray bottle of alcohol somewhere. I'll have to find that. But that is also another interesting technique that I will show you later on. So you can see that just kind of makes a splatter. I'm going to zoom in a bit so you can see that better. And then the next technique that I'm going to show you is just the wet on wet. And I'm going to show you a different kind of wet on wet, where you paint your page with water first. And then I'm going to put the colors within that water. And they're going to kind of spread around and move around. Some people call this blooms. Some people call it wet on wet. There's not really a right or a wrong name for it. the main thing is to remember, once again, that different colors do different things. And that there are multiple ways to do the wet on wet technique. Because you can absolutely do more like what we did on the salt technique, where you're putting wet colors next to each other and seeing how they interact. Or you can do a wet page and then drop the colors in, kind of like how this one is, and see how they interact that way. So that's wet on wet. We've got our alcohol and we've got our salt techniques. Now the next technique that I want to talk a little bit about is the lifting technique, which does require the first layer to completely dry. So what I'm going to do is use kind of a blue as if I was going to make a sky. And I'm just going to sort of swirl that blue around in the page, or in the space I should say, letting it have some variety to itself. Maybe put a little bit more of a darker blue in certain places. So this is wet on wet right now, because what I'm doing is going into that blue with different blues and with darker blues. And allowing those colors to sort of mix. So then the next thing I would do would be to let that dry once I get it to a point where I'm happy with sort of like the base coat of my blue there. It's going to start out pretty saturated, and then I'm going to let it dry, and then once it is dry, with the lifting technique, what you would do would be to add more water with a brush, paper towel, sponge combination, and then you can create some highlights back into it. But the thing to remember is that you will not get completely back to white this way. So if you have any white in your painting, like with our landscapes, if we are working on snow, for instance, you're not going to want to use the lifting technique to get back to the lightest values. You can use the lifting technique to get back to a lighter value and to get back to some sort of in-between values and to soften edges, but the lifting technique will not get you completely back to white. So the next technique that I'm going to show you is just the marker technique, and that is just where you take a water-soluble marker, regular old kid's marker, and you can draw a shape, you can draw a detail. I'm just going to draw a circle in 3 different colors. That black is a little duddy. There we go, that's better. And then we do a purple one. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush and just get some water on it. And I'm going to paint within that circle, including going right over the marker. Because then, as you can see, what happens is that the water-soluble marker sort of bleeds and blends to fill in that space, but it does it in a very interesting way. Especially with the black, I think. Because so many different colors make black. So when you add the water, you can see the different colors that make black. And you can add more water to lighten things up, to move things around a bit. So once again, those first 4 that I showed you are the only 4 that are required. And then the rest of them, you get to decide exactly what you do. You can definitely do a combination of things too. So if you wanted to do the marker one and see what the salt does on marker, or if you wanted to do the marker one and then see if you can do any lifting on it, or alcohol drops, or anything like that, you can definitely combine different techniques. So the next one I'm going to do is just going to go right over, and I'm going to show you guys the tissue technique. Sorry, I don't know why that circle just happened on those three, but that's okay. We'll just leave it there. And for the tissue technique, what I tend to do is to paint with one color first. Because there's a couple different ways that you can do it. You can just paint with the color and then use the tissue directly on that one color. But what I tend to do is paint with one color, let it dry, and then do another layer on top of that one with a different color, and then do the tissue, so that the tissue effect shows the color underneath. And that's kind of nice for if you are creating trees or something that has sort of that veiny texture to it. So then I'll let that dry, and then I'll go back over that with another color and show the tissue technique later. So then this next one here is the dry on wet. So what I want to do is first just get a pretty decent wet spot with color on my page. So that this particular color had lots and lots of water in it. And then what I'm going to do is on top of that, I'm going to use a smaller brush and a much, much drier color, because again, this is dry on wet. And I'm just going to get a heavily saturated dollop of that color on my brush. You kind of scrape the paint a little bit. And then I'm going to go into that wet area with a relatively dry brush and just make a mark. And you'll see that it has a very different effect than what most things would in terms of watercolor. So I'm going to do that a little bit more. It's very subtle, but it can be good for like if you have trees way off in the distance and you barely want the trunk of them to show up. That's kind of what it reminds me of. And again, just like with anything, you can build up those layers. Like if those first couple aren't dark enough for you, you can go back over them with more of that dry pigment. The first thing it's going to do is lighten the space around it. But then as things dry, you can always work back in and change things. So that might be an example of the dry on wet. And then the wet on dry, same thing as with some of the others. What we're going to do is paint a blob or a square of color first, and then we have to let it dry, and then we'll go back over it. So I'm just going to paint a rectangle here that does not take up the whole space, so that once it's dry, I can go back with another rectangle that sort of overlaps it. And where those rectangles or whatever other shape I use overlap, the colors will change. Because it's like putting two transparent shapes on top of each other almost. So you can see how that did not take up the entire space. So that once it's dry, I can overlap that one with another color. And then the two dry areas will create a different color.